It is a real honor and a treat to be here. As you just heard from Charlie, I've been season planned here and also in my mind to come here. I was able to visit once for a couple of days back before I had kids. And then I had kids, and I was in grad school, and I was teaching, and so it just kind of worked out again for some reason. But now I'm here on sabbatical. I may have this time of rest and revelation with you as I enjoy my own rest and research in my sabbatical here. It all kind of dovetails quite nicely. So my topic for this week for our conversation is forgiveness. So I've entitled this Forgiveness for Prodigals, Theological Reflection on Blame, Apologies, and Reconciliation. I will say that my tone is going to be sort of a mix of biblical, philosophical, theological kind of reflection with some asides to how this connects to pastoral work, how this connects to preaching, and how this connects to the parable of the prodigal son throughout my time here. I know David also has some great insights on these topics as well. There's going to be some great connecting, I think, for us, what his experience has been in the parish and how all of this sort of weaves together. So our hope is that over the course of the week, there'll be some nice connections come out of our talks that things emerge organically from your questions, and we're all really excited. There we go. So I'm going to take it for granted that this crowd knows the Bible fairly well. Although Lutherans, it can be iffy sometimes. Going out that lectionary gets a little bit thin. Myself included. It's hard being embarrassed by Baptists about these things. But anyway, of course, we recognize all of these kinds of passages, all of these places in the Scripture where we see forgiveness being talked about, the language of forgiveness being used. From the Psalms, petitioning God to cover over transgressions, from the work of John the Baptist in the wilderness, and of course, throughout the Gospels, here are a couple of selections from Matthew. We had Inger allude last night to the 7 times versus 77 times passage, in which Jesus pushes back on the number and gives an even larger number. One imagines counting to 77 every day is going to be really hard. Point being, just keep at the forgiveness. And finally, of course, we have forgiveness language built into our worship every time we gather and break bread. Remember this act of forgiveness. That's how it's being offered to us. So my instinct here is to say that we talk a lot about forgiveness, and the Bible does as well. We don't often pause to think about what forgiveness means, what the word actually means, how it might have better or worse understandings. Questions about why we forgive. What's the sort of goal of forgiveness? Why is it being offered, and the complexity that gets wrapped into that? And how our thoughts about God's forgiveness and forgiving others can and should be related. I'll also, by way of just a side here, mention that since I've been in the parish, now I've been sitting in the pews as a father and as a professor, some of what motivates my research are pet peeves. This happens to none of you. I was telling my father-in-law, there was a period, I got out of this, there was a period there for a while where I'd be sitting in church on Sundays, whatever church I was in, listening to the homily, and I'd have my bulletin long before you came. I stopped when my kids noticed me doing this, and my kids were like old enough to ask what I was doing, and I stopped doing this. And I would sit there in my bulletin and I'd sort of write little notes like, that's not how I read that. That's not what creep means. I never gave these to the past, I always like throw them away, but it's hard to get out of that sort of pet peeve mode. But one of my pet peeves is I feel like a lot of times when people talk about forgiveness in ways that don't quite seem to match up what I think should be the language or how it works in different contexts. And quite frankly, a lot of people like emphasize this idea of God's unconditional forgiveness in ways that fall flat for me in the pew. Not for everyone. Some people find it very helpful, but there's just things I feel like they're missing in that message. I want to try and draw some of those out. What are some of the mistakes? Forgiveness requires forgetting. You hear this a lot. You forgive, you have forgotten, sort of put it out of your mind, or erased it completely, perhaps. Forgiving someone does not require an apology. I've heard a few sermons on that. This idea that God's forgiveness just comes, or our forgiveness is just offered, and sort of waiting around for apologies, or expecting apologies, is sort of something lesser or inferior. Forgiveness is a gift. It cannot be deserved or owed. I'm going to unpack this more in a couple days from now. But I also also get a pet peeve on the language of gift. Even with Martin Luther sometimes. Sometimes the language of gift is used in ways that don't actually match up how we use gifts. The idea that you could be owed a gift sounds wrong in one sense, but sounds right in another to me, and I want to think about why that is. If my children show up on Christmas morning and there's no gifts, and I have no reason for that, they'll feel like something has gone off, and they'll want to understand that, and I think there's something to be said there. Forgiveness is unconditional. There are no obligations that follow. You've forgiven me, and we just move forward, clean slate. Nothing can be asked after forgiveness has been offered. And finally, God gives forgiveness, but does not need to be forgiven. This is a tricky one. This was my last lecture, and we'll go there towards the end after we work through what I think apologies are about, and reconciliation is about, and how that sort of redounds onto God and the Father in the parable of the prodigal son. Okay. So I'm putting all this here at the beginning, because I expect the energy will wane over the week. So now you have a sense of kind of where we're going with these things. As I said, I'm going to focus on the parable of the prodigal son, as I think it's sort of a great example of a story that often gets used to talk about forgiveness, and I think used rightly. I'm going to explain why I think forgiveness is the best way to understand this story. Even though most of our focus on the story tends to be on this moment here, in these two sort of Rembrandt depictions. This moment when the father embraces the son looks sort of bedraggled and haggard on the left. We don't see his face here on the right. We see the father's sort of warm, loving embrace as he grasps his son. We focus a lot on this moment. I want to focus on that, but also sort of broaden us to think about all the different pieces of the parable. So, by way of overview, this is how the week, I hope, will go. Fingers crossed. Trees don't get in my way on the slopes. Today, I'm going to just do an introduction and try to lay out some terms of what I think forgiveness is and how it's practiced. Explore that just briefly with you. I'm told if I go late in the morning, people get angry because of the skiing. So if I run out of time, I'll put things to an evening session. I'm back up again tomorrow night, talking about apology, why we say sorry, why that be important. Wednesday morning, again, talking about varieties of reconciliation. Let's say forgiveness has been offered, what comes after that, what follows. And then finally, as I said, on Thursday, I'll end us with thinking about a father who needs forgiveness, talking about parenting, sin, and the story of God that's embedded in the story of the prodigal son. So, resolution one. What's forgiveness? Exploring our ideas. I have 3 parts here. Part 1, what is forgiveness? A feeling, an action, or a virtue? Well, there's a ton of literature about forgiveness. If you go to any sort of bookstore, that's the thing we do anymore. You go to a bookstore, you peruse the shelves, and you'll see plenty of books with the title Forgiveness, with the idea of forgiveness. A lot of them are sort of the therapeutic, self-help, or spiritual direction, which is just self-help, masking this piety. You'll see a lot of these things there, right? Talking about this therapeutic value of forgiveness. Often the idea is that here forgiveness is some kind of has emotional import. It's some sort of feeling you can direct towards others or yourself. And again, there's a real emphasis on the therapeutic value of forgiveness. Right? That this resentment you're holding, this anger you're holding, this not forgiving, is somehow holding you back or burdening you in ways that you need to let go of. Right? It's like eating away at you. It's gross effect. So that means forgiveness. There's something right about this. All things I think are wrong, usually there's something kind of right about them. This is the way things usually work. I would say that forgiveness does involve negative feelings like this, especially feelings of anger and resentment. Maybe the ones that are most associated with where forgiveness comes in and starts doing its work. So it might be depicted like this, right? Taking all those negative feelings, resentment should be in there. It's not just anger. You toss it in and you sort of walk away. The problem with this, the reason I think this is sort of an incomplete understanding of forgiveness, is you'll notice in this picture, it's just one person. Right? This guy's walking along, he's carrying these burdens, he sets down these burdens, and he sort of goes down the road. Perhaps there's somebody on the other side of each part of this road. But it seems to leave the other person, the one who's being forgiven, out of the picture. If you think about this, if you're reading a book about how you need to forgive people who have wronged you in the past, you have absolutely no need to have any contact with those people on this model. They could be way behind you, they could be dead, whatever. Forgiving somebody who isn't there and not really focus on the relationship with that person, or about a relationship with yourself. So in a sense, this makes sense. It's sort of instrumental understanding of forgiveness. You're doing it to get to a better sense of health and wholeness. And I'm all for health and wholeness. But I think it's missing something important about what forgiveness is actually doing. To get away from the focus on feelings, we can go to thinking about forgiveness as an action. Right? Something you do, not just something internal, but something external. Something maybe you do for or give to another person. And I like this, because it gets us out of an excessive focus on ourselves. But I feel like we're still left with questions about why you're doing this, or why you're giving this forgiveness as a gift, as an offer to someone else. And that's something that's perplexed a lot of thinkers. On your left, there we go. I got a picture here of the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. French philosophers always look so cool. I feel like I need to up my aesthetic. Start smoking fake cigarettes or something to give an allure to myself. But Derrida was very critical of the idea of forgiveness and the idea of gift giving in general. And so he comes up with this idea of pure gifts or pure forgiveness. And for him, a pure gift is one that is given essentially for no reason at all. So nothing in the person you're giving a gift to could be deserving or give you a cause to give them this gift. Nor could you ever expect anything out of the person you give a gift to. Otherwise, you're just giving them a gift you would think to get something back, and you're caught in this sort of cycle of exchange and dependence and obligation. That's problematic. So he's talking about questions about motivations and obligations, gifts and forgiveness that seek something from attachments. He thinks all these are going to be impure, and all these are going to be somewhat suspect. Not necessarily bad, in sort of a hard sense. A necessary and important thing, perhaps, in our world, but always less than the ideal sort of pure gift or pure forgiveness. I would say you get similar pieces of this in our Christian tradition, even in our dear friend Martin Luther on occasion. What do I mean by that? Well, there are strands of Christian thought that talk about forgiving and forgiveness and grace and gift and all of these things, where our motives are always somewhat suspect, if we have motives at all. So Anders Nygren, Scandinavian ethicist and theologian, wrote this giant volume on agape and eros, contrasting two different kinds of love as he saw it present in the ancient world and in the Christian tradition. Eros is this sort of erotic, but more specifically a desiring love. It wants the other, it wants something from the other. Whereas Nygren thought agape was this love that expected nothing, looked for nothing, gave for no reason. And there are passages where he talks about, for example, God's love for us, how that works in us, and echoing words that sound similar to what Luther would say sometimes, talks about us as being like an empty tube. That love just sort of flows down and out. And a tube generally has no desire. It's my expectation of tubes, conduits, pipes. They just kind of are there. They're just kind of letting stuff go through. And that's what they're there for. Evacuated. And Luther, again, can point in this direction sometimes as well, though I think he doesn't mean what Nygren means. And I think he's misread in some ways on this, and mispreached in some ways on this as well. So what do I want to say? Well, I want us to think this week together about forgiveness as something that brings together both affect, emotion, and action. It brings our whole self into it. And I'm going to talk about forgiveness as a virtue. I'm trying to connect emotions, actions, and reasons behind those actions. So, crash course on virtue. Just to be clarified, I did my dissertation on Luther and virtue, so I'm really into virtue language and the framework. My experience is that Lutherans are not really into virtue. Agree with me? Not that they aren't virtuous and don't embody and practice virtues, they just are sort of inoculated very strongly in the Darius Miser style against common virtue. Part of this, if I can get in a plug for my Chicago upbringing at LSTC, part of this seems to be connected to some of the stuff at Luther's seminary that I get an experience, focused on law and gospel sometimes, some of the stuff with like Gerhard Forde or even like Mark Mavis or Paul today. There's this real emphasis on virtue being something that like the medievals or the Catholics did, that Aristotle was about, and that Lutherans saved us from. And I think that's both a wrong reading of what Luther was doing and a wrong reading of what virtue tradition was about. So it seems doubly wrong. So part of my goal in life is to try and offer some correction to what I think is wrong about all of that. So you need to be a part of that effort of mine. Okay. So what is virtue about? Virtue tends to reflect on this idea of habit. Meaning we have certain dispositions to act well or not that are developed in us, built up in us. They build up in different ways. There's no sort of hard claim here that it comes only one kind of way. There's a whole literature and history on this idea of acquired virtues, like riding a bike, or something you get for yourself, versus infused virtues God gives to you. Whole lots of literature, a lot of complicated things here. But at the end of the day, it's simply the idea that you need to have some kind of disposition in yourself to act in a certain way, otherwise you won't act in that way. If you know how to ski, you won't be able to ski. And that knowing how to ski comes in variations and gradations. And that, good Lord willing, one might be able to get better at it. That doesn't mean that you invented skiing. You deserve praise for getting better at it. You deserve recognition for sort of being a better skier than me, so you should take lessons from Frank, not Anthony. That kind of thing. And part of the virtue tradition in the language talks about this idea of acting in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. A lot of complicated facets built into this. So what looks like courage in one situation might just be foolishness. And so it's kind of hard to tell what's going on there. And usually you don't know until after the fact, when people are assessing what we did right beside and draw lessons from exemplars. One person's exemplar for courage is another person's exemplar for foolishness, or rashness. One person's exemplar for the vice of, saying, being afraid. Another person's exemplar of actual true courage. Courageous to sacrifice your life, or to not sacrifice it. To take a life or not take it. These are the kind of debates people get into, rightfully so. There's also a sense in the virtue tradition that virtues are good for our flourishing. Sometimes you see the word happiness, which is a slight mistranslation or misappropriation of what the language is about. The idea is that the reason we have virtues is they make us better people. They make us better in the sense that we can do the things that we need to do better. We had some joking last night from Joel about finances and pastors. Part of the reason that joke lands with us well is because we know that in order to be good at money, you'd have some skills. Hopefully a decent grasp of math, a little bit of prudence, other kinds of things built in there, and that makes sense to us. For some reason, when you're talking about religion and God, all that stuff making sense, that does not make sense to me. So, get to that. Oh, just because something is good for you doesn't mean it's only good for you. Right? Being a good parent is something that I value and want to achieve. It's only good because I want to be a good parent in relationship to my children, the rest of my family, and those around me. If I take myself and isolate myself out of that relationship context, yes, it seems very selfish. If I'm walking around saying, well, I'm a great parent, I've cultivated the virtue of parenting, which is a virtue I just made up, and I am excelling at it, you're going to go, that doesn't feel quite right. And a lot of folks will say, actually, the people who talk about being virtuous are the ones who usually aren't. Yeah. Usually people pointing to you and saying, you're a great parent, or you're a great preacher. And Inger's going to get a little bit anxious and nervous. Because of upbringing or disposition or other things. So there's something about having other people tell us these things sort of breaks us out of this self-centered cycle of me getting things for myself and then receive like honor and praise or something weird like that. Okay, so because virtues are, I'll try it there, typo. I'll fix that for next time. Because virtues have a way they should be exercised, there's an A, and a goal they are seeking, they can be done well or poorly, and can succeed or fail in reaching their goal. There's a variety of ways that our virtues and our actions and our lives can go wrong. Some of the ancients try to prevent this from being a problem. If a virtue is just a thing inside of you, it doesn't depend on what happens outside of you, that gives you a little more security in your virtue, and you become a stoic. Who cares if my children live or die? When I've cultivated the virtue of good parenting. Don't say that. Yes?
my pen blew up, so I had to run to the restroom to wash my hands off.
Okay.
But I missed, define virtue for me.
Sure.
Like, maybe you already covered it, but.
I was trying to do a sort of a fast and loose definition, but a virtue is a disposition that enables one to act well. Let's put it that way. Generally, they're discussed of as similar to habits. You think of a habit like riding a bike or skiing. Those can be more skills, but they still are habits. Here we're thinking more of intellectual or moral habits. So ways of thinking well or acting well. What all goes into that? Where those habits come from, how they're cultivated or not, who deserves recognition for having them, in what ways, what counts or not as one of these good habits or one of these bad habits. I'm leaving all that somewhere else. Yep. All right. So here's my working definition for forgiveness then, based on all of this. This will appear throughout the lectures and all that kind of stuff. I can share things afterwards. I didn't bother printing out handouts, but I can share slides and outlines after the fact as well. So forgiveness is a virtue that directs us to let go of negative attitudes, especially resentment, towards others who have committed some wrong against us, with the hope of a better relationship to come. So see, I'm trying to pick up on all the different pieces that I think are important that some sort of incomplete or partial approaches to forgiveness are getting at. There's something about our emotional affective state, when we feel about things. It's not just feelings in general, it's feelings towards others when something wrong has occurred. And it's ordered to something beyond that, not just letting go of resentment towards another person who wronged us, but with something beyond that this act is looking for or hoping for. These pieces will be reiterated and become clearer as we move on. Plenty of time. Second major section, close enough, in the neighborhood of forgiveness. Based on what I've said so far, I want to say there are other ways that we approach wrongs and harms and relationships and resentment and reconciliation that sometimes get the job done, but still aren't quite forgiveness. What do I mean by that? Well, I think part of our confusion about forgiveness comes in the fact that the word gets used pretty loosely to apply to a lot of different phenomena, experiences, and situations. And I want to just more closely inspect some of these and see what might be different or distinct about these different uses of forgiveness in our language and in the sources we draw from. And there are 5 of these I'm going to touch on. Exemption, excuse, forgetting, and 2 different ways of thinking about being pardoned, either in a legal sense or in an economic sense. Let me break these down. Exemption. We've been harmed in some way, but the source of this harm does not or cannot bear the weight of responsibility. In short, there is no one there to blame. Sometimes we talk about forgiving in these kinds of situations, but then we realize that forgiveness doesn't quite apply because there's no responsibility or blame at work. For example, hitting the slopes. When you all signed up for R&R, or Black Society for Beer Grove, and then couldn't find the website and figured it out, you were hoping for this, right? Either to watch or to participate in. Fluffy powder, clear skies, smiling, went down. I guess this is good snow, I don't know. This is what got with Google Images. And then you show up. You got this. And you're standing there in your sad little patch of snow, and you're screaming, and you're angry, and you're resentful, and you're calling Charlie and saying, "What is this? I promised snow skiing." And Charlie will look back at you and go like, "Well, I mean, I don't control the weather. You're misunderstanding my role in the organizing team." And you start yelling at the clouds and the sky and nature too much, people are going to say, "Well, I understand that you're upset. I don't think that the earth owes you an apology for a slightly less enjoyable ski week." Oh, ye of great privilege. This also happens, in my experience, with children.
Oh, yeah.
Now, any of you have been a parent or have been exposed to children for more than 10 minutes? know that quite often they can do things that make you quite angry and resentful. This hasn't happened to you when you do some drug screening or some psychological evaluation. This is what children do. And as my generation does a lot of times, we often sort of complain about our children, not in front of them. Behind their backs, whispers, lots of blank. And we often, sometimes I talk about them in ways that make them into full-grown, responsible agents of our misfortune. These damn kids just needling me. This baby is trying to destroy my life.
Yeah.
I'll never sleep again. I miss sleep. Sleep was good. Sound familiar enough? If you've never run other people or parents or family, yeah, we get it. Here we get it. We start taking it a little too seriously. They will say, "What? That's not right. It isn't really the baby's fault in any sense. That's what babies just do." It's a little different than blaming the snow, because you actually have a living creature there. But at the same time, it's a different kind of creature. In my experience, the hardest time for me so far has been actually right now, is my children are 8 and 11, and they're like, "You're not babies anymore, toddlers. So I can have more expectations for you, but you're not adults." Well, some adults are toddlers. It has to be confusing in some respects. A lot of middle ground here. So I'm trying to figure out what level of responsibility can I expect of you? How should I modulate my response to you in light of that? And how am I going to try better when I fail today at doing all of those things? Other examples of this concern issues of mental illness. When folks literally can't control their reactions to things, their experience of things, which is true of all of us some of the times in some ways, and some people more often than others. We come to understand that having people the same expectations during situations or conditions of mental illness, or anguish, or great despair seems to be wrong and just. So if you said, "I forgive you for being depressed," is that right? Even though a partner's depression or a friend's depression might greatly negatively impact their relationships, your life, their work, things might go to hell real quick. You might need to let go of anger and resentment. If you said, "I forgive you," it's going to clue us in that something is off. Alright. So we have been harmed by another, but the one who harmed us did so under mitigating and reasonable circumstances. Some conditions of responsible agency have not been met. This, I'm going to say, slides us out of sort of exculpation or exemption into the realm of excuse, which is where a lot of us spend a lot of our time. And the Greek word here we see all over the place. Syndrome, sort of think or think together, sort of way. The same thought. But think of these situations where people are acting under duress, coercion, or extreme conditions. Again, not to the level of sort of mental illness, incapacitation of some kind, but still something is going on that's altering your normal way of behaving because of the conditions you're in. Raising questions about how voluntary this is or how intentional this is. The classic example that Aristotle and the ancients liked to use was people throwing stuff off of a ship during a storm. There's a giant storm, the ship's going down, you gotta lessen the weight, lessen the load, you throw the cargo off. Are you to blame for that? Well, you did it voluntarily. You were sort of a puppet being controlled to throw things off. But your ship was going down. So you had to make a tough decision. That's the one you made. Or there's a big storm. There's this guy on board who apparently is the reason for that storm. You don't normally throw your passengers off the boat. But sometimes you're on the mountain, you're skiing, you're complaining too much, off into the woods, and you move on forward. Okay? So each of these conditions, right, we recognize that the person under different conditions would have acted differently. They're giving us reasons, or we see reasons, to sort of lessen the load of their blame. But they still might bear some blame, and so we're kind of trying to figure what to do with that. Even though we understand you threw the cargo off, it wasn't actually a storm. It wasn't as stormy as you thought. We should have tried other things before you threw the cargo or before you thrown it into the ocean. Right? We sort of work with things that way. Forgetting, I said we talk about forgiveness as forgetting a lot of times, but this raises, I think, a a whole host of serious issues. First of all, can you tell somebody to forget? Forgetting be something that you willfully do. Sometimes my wife thinks that I willfully forget things. I try to assure her that there is no active desire on my part to forget things. It is all the grace of God. Holy Spirit working mysteriously in my life, put things behind. She would counter by saying, I couldn't actively try to remember things. And then I would say, I'm sorry. Move forward. But you can't sort of will yourself to forget. This would also raise real problems with the wrong that was done. You've really completely forgotten. Then it's like the thing never happened. You've lost the ability to talk about what went wrong, what happened. Or to see how things are different in light of that wrong. Same issues, I think, as the therapeutic I was saying above. This ends up being internal for yourself, and any sense of reconciliation disappears. You're not really reconciling, you're simply resetting. And so I'd like to say that the topic of forgetting should be thought of in metaphorical terms. It's signaling a choice or desire to leave the sake of the past behind, for the sake of the future. So you forget the harms because you're not letting the past determine necessarily the future. But you aren't really forgetting. Additionally, I'm talking about God. The idea of God forgetting makes all kinds of weird ideas in my head. I'm not sure what your doctrine of God is like, but a God who forgets things seems to be not the kind of God that I've experienced in the scripture in my life. And it gets into all kinds of kind of predicates of God's being. Are we engaging in God? Literally forgets things. Metaphorically, good. Literally, it seems bad. Forget Jesus. Forget me. Promise. I love that. Next forgiveness adjacent thing is going to be pardon in the legal sense. Pardoning happens when an act is issued, I'd say, from a recognized legal or political authority. This is kind of that paradigm where pardoning comes from. We think of it sometimes in silly ways, at least I do. President Barack Obama here engaging in this presidential theater of forgiving one turkey, not the other 390 million who did not win this favor that day. Usually in pardoning, it's a third party, not the victim, who's offering the pardon. Unless Barack Obama was himself going to kill that turkey had wronged him in some way. I'm not quite sure how that would work out. Usually pardon comes from somebody not removing the actual conflict of the harm or the wrong that's happening. And it often can leave, I'm going to do better proofreading here, leave blame and guilt questions unanswered. When somebody's pardoned, are they guilty? Were they guilty? Sometimes they were found guilty. Maybe the governor or the president said, I think the trial wasn't handled well. Or there were extenuating circumstances that didn't take into account. Sometimes pardons come before any admission of guilt, any trial, any real sense of the crime has been committed or not. And this creates all kinds of challenges for the reasons the pardon were offered. They can vary and make them kind of suspect in our assessment. The pardon still stands. Having questionable motivations for pardoning doesn't undo the effect of pardoning. You can pardon for all kinds of cronyistic, selfish reasons. You might feel resentment towards that, but it doesn't change the fact that the person who's given a pardon now has a pardon. The law is written, the act has been done, this is it. More questions came out of the pardon of Nixon, which some folks here might remember in memory. Right. Ford's explanation was he wanted the country to move on and heal. Other folks said maybe healing could have been achieved by a trial, and some time in prison. And then in the wake of things, Nixon never apologized. One time he was pressed in an interview a few years later, and he said, essentially, I resigned the office. Isn't that an apology? And reflexively go, I don't think so. Right? It's like a different thing. And then actually saying, I did wrong, and I'm sorry, I should not have done that. Nixon seemed to have problems understanding forgiveness, apologies, and doing wrong. It's a general policy. Final thing that I think here is forgiveness adjacent. We say is the language of pardon, but in an economic sense, not necessarily just a legal, juridical sense. When a person's debts are reduced or canceled by a person or entity authorized to do so. And all these are my sort of ad hoc definitions. You can use Webster's or Oxford if you want to get theirs out there as well. The language, of course, of forgiveness or as pardon in this sense, in this sentiment, is all over the Bible, particularly the New Testament. You've seen some of it in the passages I had before. But there are questions here as well, right? As I said, forgiveness, as I'm understanding it, refers to something that was wrong. They did something they should not have done. When you are in debt, have you done something wrong? Please forgive my student loans. They're very sorry and they won't do it again. Nonetheless, sometimes we talk about people who are in debt as if they've done something wrong. And that may be the case in terms of financial choices, how they use the money, why they took the money out. Right? That could certainly happen. But just being in debt itself doesn't sort of say whether or not you're right or wrong, to blame or not. Sort of packed in a lot of other assumptions about what's going on in that situation to get to that point. But there are many instances where you are in debt, you owe money, you've done nothing wrong in any direct sort of sense. Unless you start getting sort of really abstract and pulling away into sort of the idea of debt in general is wrong. Anybody who's in debt is somehow participating in usury or capitalism exploitation, down with banks, down with everybody, all that makes some sense. To me, in the back of my mind, but that doesn't make sense of why you would call this person wrong or to be blamed for being in debt, or needing a loan, start a business, or go to college. The reasons for offering pardon also vary. Why would I pardon your debts? It could be moved by a sense that you'll never repay them, and sort of recognize your humanity and want to lift this burden from you. Could be that you're never going to pay me, so it's not worth my time to bother chasing you anymore. Or I've chased you for 10 years, and you've worked in a church or nonprofit, and the government's going to say, we'll let you go now. Thanks to sort of the new adapted rules. Everybody who needs that should sign up for that. Thank you, Congress and Biden. So there are all these moments when you might be forgiven a debt for all kinds of reasons. They aren't necessarily about addressing anger or resentment or moving towards reconciliation. There's just a lot of other reasons at play. In the ancient world, I think sometimes in our own as well, pardon was understood in a much different sense than I'm going to talk about forgiveness. Pardon often came from the largesse or magnanimity of the superior party in this relationship. Why is it that kings can pardon? Look how powerful and strong they are. They can let it slide. In fact, they would become too offended at somebody who owed them things that would show them to be lesser than they project themselves to be. And the fact that they give away a pardon, that they're going to look at them and say, wow, how great this person is. So they're looking to get some reaction or some honor by the act of pardon. Additionally, oftentimes in the ancient world, we'll talk about this in a couple of days, pardon was offered as a way of indebting the person to you in a different sort of way. Now that I've given you this pardon, released you from this debt, you now go out into the street and say, oh, this is so awesome. Ed is such an amazing guy. He pardoned this debt. Let me tell you all this story of Ed. His glory. I've written a song called the Song of Ed and His Largesse. 17 verses. Bonus song. And Ed comes to me and says, Anthony, I need you to come help me out with this problem I'm having. I go, of course. Someone as gracious and pardoning as yourself, I will be there at a moment's notice. Fortunately, I don't owe Ed any money, so I'm good. Okay. What I want to say is that a lot of New Testament texts that draw on this pardon economic language, we see it again all over the place. Well, we might be talking about forgiveness in a sense, something adjacent to forgiveness. They seem to be emphasizing most of the time the sense of relief, joy, and expected gratitude that those who have been pardoned are expected to have. So forgiveness kind of works in the same way that loan forgiveness kind of works, a phrase we understand. But loan forgiveness and forgiveness to a partner or a friend seems different. If my student loans get wiped out, or some of them do, when you dance in the street, you're going to feel great. You're going to feel gratitude at the people who made this possible, gratitude for having a job to pay off whatever I was able to pay off, gratitude for having whatever the loans got me. But I'm not going to feel like I was wrong in the beginning. I need to look for forgiveness from me. Okay, I'm going to end my time, last 10 minutes or so here, taking some of this and looking at specifically the text in the prodigal son of us all. I'll assume you all know it. I just want to break it down into some pieces and see if you can add a couple of things to set us up for the time ahead. As I said, we often focus on this part of the story, right? This embrace, the father runs out, pulls up his robes, hugs his sons, throws on sandals and rings. This is where our preaching, our attention, tends to zero in. The story begins a little bit earlier. Jesus said there's a man who has two sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So the father divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. A lot in there. Compact, quick. You don't know how long this actually takes. Maybe a few days for the whole process. Immediately, we should be confused by this story, right? It takes me more than a few days to be packed up for field program. This father has sort of dissolved 1/3 of his property, given it to the younger son, has said not a word about being told by your son, "You're dead to me." The son gets a fast donkey out of town and squanders the money, who knows how quickly. He put it all in the Bengals. And that was it. So then he spent everything. Severe famine took place out of that country, and he began to be in need. So he went to hire himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He gladly filled himself with the pods the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. So here we have a real strong sense, I'm sure all you good preachers know this. The status of being an indentured servant of some kind, a day laborer, is one of the lowest of the low. Economically, socially, well, even lower than slaves. The slaves can depend on the family that takes care of them for some kind of minimum protection. In some context, in the Jewish context, yes, Romans, it's a little bit rougher. Well, in the South, the United States, a little different ballpark entirely. But point here being in this context, he's fallen to the bottom of the ladder. Next stop is the grave. But he came to himself. I don't know how or why, but he did. He said, "How many of his father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up or fall down and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands." So then he set off and went to his father. I'm going to tease this part a little bit more tomorrow. Think about the apology of the son's sort of motivations and thoughts here. Here it's sort of undetermined in some ways as to why he's going back. Clearly, he's recognizing his need because he's hungry. He knows he's going to die soon. But he also uses the language of sin. Sinned against heaven, God, and my dad. So he knows he's done wrong, maybe in a way that he didn't know before. Talk a little more about that. And I'm always curious to wonder how long it took him to get back to his father. I imagine it was a slower walk back when he's hungry than he was walking with a pocket full of coin and such. While he was still far off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him, and then he said, Son said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And dad cuts him off there. But not before. Curious. But the father said to his slaves, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive, he was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. A lot of folks put emphasis on this sort of the gratuitousness of the father's joy that his son comes back. Other social science history buffs point out that he had to do this feast to keep the community from killing his son. They're find a way to reintegrate the son who was lost and be seen as the guy who took a third of his property, right, sold it off, took the money from our village, and walked down to Jerusalem or wherever with it. Right, Jerusalem because he's tending pigs. Far off country, he walked off to Tyre or something, and he gives all this money to those dirty Gentiles, and then he comes back with nothing. So he has to do this for this reason. What's going on here? Now his elder son was in the field. When he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what's going on. Father would come back, kill the cat, etc., etc. Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat. I might celebrate with my friends. When the son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed a fatted calf for him? I'm sure a few of you have had some sympathies with the older brother. That you or someone else in your family. There's a sense in which his anger seems justified. I'm going to say that it is. But not for the reasons that he thinks it is. The things I want to tease out. Additionally, put a pin in this again for Thursday as well. Notice that this father has a pair of questionable sons. That should give us pause for just a moment. Particularly in our desire parables, we always want to make God the Father into whatever father figure we can project into a text. Or whoever has the most money, the king or the rich person is always God in the parables. That could be the case. I think there's some reasons to use God in the father figure here. But notice that this father figure lives in a home with bad children, presumably he raised. Puzzled about this, both as a reader of the Bible and as a parent. Then the father said to him, son, you were always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. I love the language the father uses. He says, we had to celebrate. As I hinted at the beginning, we often like to talk about the language of gift as being unconditional, gratuitous, anonymous, given for no reason. The father says, we had no choice. That gift is being given freely. His father understands himself as to have no freedom and response right here. At least not in the sense that he could have done differently. That's puzzling. Alright. So again, we're going to be thinking this week about forgiveness as a virtue. It directs us to let go of negative attitudes and the resentment and the focus towards others who have committed some wrong against us with the hope of a better relationship to come. I want to just say that the language of forgiveness describes the situation better than other terms or ideas when we look at the story of the prodigal son. We can think about it in terms of pardon or exemption or excuse. None of that quite fits in the same way, I want to say, as forgiveness does. So I want us to think about that. So the questions that will be at play in the next few lectures, the next few days together as we're talking and thinking together, is what forgiveness requires, if it should or should not be offered. There's a real instinct amongst Christians to say that one always forgives, one always forgives before an apology, one always has to offer forgiveness. And I'm going to say, pump the brakes. Let's think about why that might be okay to say in some contexts and not others. Why it's actually harmful and abusive, what undermines what forgiveness is even trying to do. short-circuiting the work that forgiveness is trying to accomplish. And its goal. Resentment is actually let go of. The relationship actually grows beyond that point, or not. Sometimes there's a tendency to say that if the relationship doesn't come, then forgiveness has failed. I want to say it's probably true. It might have failed for different reasons. The one offering forgiveness or the one receiving it. It doesn't mean that the forgiveness wasn't actually offered before. It just means that it didn't get where it hoped to get. And what kinds of relationships? This will be for Wednesday. We talk about reconciliation. We talk about coming back together. Now, when I suggest coming back together, doesn't mean going back to the way things were. Nor does it mean only one kind of relationship has to follow. It's become clear for us to think about different ways we reconcile with people that don't involve things looking the same. It'll be a new relationship, a different relationship. I hope that happens in the part of the story as well. Okay? Yeah, I can say all this. And I will sort of hint at the end of the week, too, that the unfinished story leaves us a little bit hanging, right? Where we just ended, we have an older son yelling at the dad gives a response, and then the story ends. Like so many of our good stories do, a little bit too soon, perhaps, for our interest, but there's something there about this sort of hanging question mark at the end of the story that I think hangs over all of our acts of forgiveness in this life, be it between us or between us and God. So why I say that? Alright, so tomorrow, I'll keep going. We'll dig more into apology, why I want to stand and claim that apologies are necessary, why they're necessary, what they look like. And I want to say, by way of teaser, that you can't actually forgive somebody without an apology. You're doing something else. It's not quite forgiveness. Sound good? Yeah. All right. Thanks for your time. Be safe.